Hello and welcome to Noble Mind.
Noble Mind is a podcast exploring mindfulness, meditation, and psychology.
Before we get started, I want to invite you to come to Unwind, a free drop-in practice session that I'm leading each week on Zoom. It lasts about 30 minutes and just long enough, hopefully, to fit between all your other tasks and to-dos. Each week, I give a brief science-backed tip to help with stress management or well-being enhancement. Then we spend about 15 minutes in a guided relaxation, meditation, or contemplation practice. Lastly, we end with a few minutes for discussion and personal connection. I encourage people to make the session work for themselves, so if you prefer to call in or keep your camera off, that is just fine. You can get more details and sign up to get the Zoom link and call-in information at drkateking.com/unwind. Hope to see you there. Hello, I'm Dr. Kate King.
And I'm Alex Gökçe. In this episode, we talk to Professor Paul Gilbert, the developer of compassion-focused therapy. We discuss evolutionary psychology, masculinity, shame, and how mindful compassion can restore sanity to destructive and competitive human impulses. Paul Gilbert is professor of clinical psychology at the University of Derby and consultant clinical psychologist at the Derbyshire Healthcare Foundation Trust. He has researched evolutionary approaches to psychopathology for over 35 years with a special focus on shame and the treatment of shame-based difficulties, for which compassion-focused therapy was developed. He has written and edited 20 books and established the Compassionate Mind Foundation in 2006. He was awarded an OBE in March 2011.
You can get this episode's show notes and join our email list at noblemindpodcast.com. We hope you enjoy the show. We are here with Professor Paul Gilbert, accomplished scholar and author and clinical psychologist. Welcome to Noble Mind. We'd love to have you maybe just get us started off by telling our listeners a little bit about yourself and your work and what you're passionate about.
Well, thanks, Kate and Alex, for inviting me to come and speak on Noble Minds. That's wonderful. So a little bit of my background then. So I was originally an economist, actually, and back in 1973. And then I changed to become a psychologist and went to Edinburgh and did my PhD on depression and was studying some of the psychophysiological processes in depression and was always very interested in the way in which our brain chemistries and body chemistries can be changed by psychological and physical social processes. Now, in the 70s and early 80s, we had three basic models. One was learned helplessness, so that if you are subjected to stresses and difficulties you can't control, then your system starts to shut down. You get shut down, you get this helpless state, which was linked to depression. Then there was John Bowlby's model, which was the attachment model, which argued that, if infants in particular, but also later in life, if we get disconnected from caring others or if we don't have access to caring others, then the brain reads that as being a reasonably dangerous place and can also shut down. Now, John Bowlby called that despair states. And I was interested in that because when I was in Edinburgh, I was able to spend quite a lot of time on the depression unit because it was a specialist unit and just talking to clients, And this was a very common theme, this concept of feeling disconnected, not belonging, out of touch, like there's a glass wall between me and other people. So the attachment system was very interesting. But the research I did was on the rank system, social rank system, which is about power, oppression, and so on. And that when animals get harassed or attacked, that they can't defend themselves against, and they also go into these shut down, depressed states. They hide in the corners and don't come out and all that stuff. And actually, my wife did a study on cockroaches. And it was the same in cockroaches. The subordinate ones, the ones that got attacked, they went and hid in the corner and were quite depressed, really. I mean, I don't know what a depressed cockroach looks like. So that was my background, really. And then I went on to look at how different motivational systems are linked to different states, and so on. So that was my background there. And then, obviously, in terms of therapy, the therapies that were really taking off in the 80s were Tim Beck's cognitive therapies. And Edinburgh was one of the places that did the first trials on cognitive therapy in the UK. So I got very much into that as a technique, as a therapeutic technique. But my model had always been an evolutionary biopsychosocial model, understanding that our social relationships, are very important for the regulation of mental states and physical states, particularly if you, as a child, if you come from a caring environment or an abusive environment. These have fundamental impacts on the physiology of the maturing brain. So that was my background. And it was when doing CBT for chronic and severe depression that the penny dropped about compassion, really. So in CBT, as you know, you help people to identify some of the kind of depressive thoughts or ideas or beliefs that they have, and then they stand back and they generate alternatives and so forth. So working with one lady who had a very severe depression, bipolar, and various other things, a lot of suicide attempts. And we'd been doing some CBT. Now, she had been adopted as a baby, probably around 9 months to a year, into quite a difficult family, actually. She was criticized quite a lot and so on and so on. So she had this basic feeling that she hadn't really been wanted. She shouldn't have been born. She was unlovable. And that although she knew her husband loved her and her children cared for her, which they did, they were quite a close family, she still had this underlying feeling that that's only because they were nice people. It wasn't really because she had anything that was genuinely lovable about her, but they were nice people and they wouldn't, So anyway, so one day we were generating the alternatives. I feel unlovable, I feel I'm inferior, and feel what is. And the alternatives was, yes, but my husband cares about me and he shows how he's caring and doing this, that, and the other. And my kids care about me and I've got friends and I've held down a job. So all those alternative thoughts she could, and she'd say to me, yeah, well, I know they're true in a way, but I just can't feel them. Now, this head-heart lag was a real issue in CBT. So by the mid-'80s, it was very clear that changing cognition didn't always change emotion. And so I asked her one day, I'd like to say it was a stroke of genius, but really I think I just didn't know what else to say. I asked her, how do you actually hear those alternative thoughts in your mind? When you're reading out that your husband loves you and stuff, how do you hear them? How do they land for you? Can you speak them out as you actually hear them in your mind? And she was a little embarrassed and said, what, as I actually hear them? And I said, yeah, as you actually hear them. And she said, okay. And this is what happened. Come on, you're doing cognitive therapy, aren't you? You got a husband who loves you. You got children. Look at the evidence, for God's sake, woman. Pull yourself together. I was quite shocked. So it turned out that the criticism was being carried in the affect, not in the content. And that was really quite surprising. And then I started asking other clients about that, clients who were doing pretty good with some of their cognitive alternatives. And quite embarrassedly, they would say the same. It was either cold logic or it was slightly hostile and contemptuous. Not only that, but when they were doing thought monitoring charts and homeworks, they'd be kind of irritated. Do I have to do this? Oh, God, I got to challenge my bloody thoughts. So the affect was not at all compassionate. So that was the first shock. So the second thing was, and I said, well, what about if you imagined a compassionate part of you with a genuine understanding of the sadness of your life, the struggle in your life to be loved and wanted, and what about creating that tone in your head? Create that tone in your head. And she said, absolutely not. I wouldn't do that. I can't see how that's going to help me. Kindness is all very well, but I've got to find something that makes me believe this. Now, this is interesting because, of course, in her family, her adoptive family, the mother was like this. I'm going to make you believe it. I'm going to make you see this. And it was quite a harsh sort of critical thing. So that was the second shock, that a lot of these clients simply didn't want to do it. And the third shock was when they started to do it, some of them actually really began to start dissociating and having lots of problems. Now, I have to tell you that in a way, that was me being very naive, because now I look at it, it's pretty obvious. The fact is that any motivational system that has a toxic event or has a series of toxic events becomes problematic. So if you imagine, you enjoy going on holidays, isn't it wonderful? But then one holiday you get badly beaten up and put into hospital. Next year you start thinking about holidays, you won't be remembering all the wonderful things. The trauma memory will come back at you. If you think about, sexuality, isn't it wonderful? Isn't it great? Isn't it lovely? But then you get raped. Then when you begin to have sexual experiences, you won't be remembering all the wonderful things. You'll be traumatized. The trauma will come back at you. The same for the caring system, right? Mm-hmm. If the caring system has got trauma memories of neglect or abuse or whatever it is, you start to open that up with compassion, which you will, getting the vagus nerve going, all that stuff. What's going to come back is not, oh, isn't it wonderful? I can be kind to myself. Isn't that lovely? You'll get something quite different. And that's what was happening. And so we discovered two major things, really. One was this unprocessed grief. So when you begin to engage with it, for some clients, the grief is just outstandingly painful. They begin to recognize how much they have yearned. I mean, it's a deep, deep yearning to be loved and wanted. I mean, it really is. And, when they cry, I mean, the whole body sobs. And you find yourself tearing up as well. So this lady, for example, would start to talk about some of her experiences. Because if you run into these fears, blocks, and resistances, the most important thing is to see them as wisdoms. They're wisdoms. Can't go there. It's not that they won't go there. It's that they can't, because if they start to open it up, the pain is enormous. So you start to work more in the background and beginning to find out what that pain's about. You talk about it as the wisdom of resistance. And then she would start telling me stories. And one of the stories, she says, when I used to get hit by my adopted mother, I would go to my room and, of course, I'd be crying and I'd look at the stars, and I see them all twinkling. And I would imagine that my biological mother was still looking for me and searching for me. And the stars would form a chariot and she would come and rescue me. Mm. And so she'd be sobbing for this yearning for her biological mother to still want her. And I would be tearing up, the secretary up the road, up the corridor. Oh my God, so sad, so sad. That was the other thing that I was quite amazed by, if you want, and moved by, was that when you do open this up, the amount of desperate yearning to be loved, the desperate sense of, am I good enough? Am I lovable? Does anybody really want me? The sense of deep emptiness was intense. But if you work through it, then the clients really do improve. The other one is you can have an enormous rage towards abuse or whatever, which clients are incredibly frightened of. So that's the other one that you can get. So those were the kind of key things, really. And then beginning to think about, if we can get these cognitive systems going, what are we actually doing in the brain and the body? And then, of course, there are people like Steve Porges who came along and started to talk to us about polyvagal theory and various other things. So things started to fit together, that if we could produce these motivational switches, these switches from this more competitive, I have to prove myself, I'm not good enough, into a caring motivational system, which has a very different physiological architecture, we could start to produce changes. And that's basically the story of CFT.
I'd love to go back to that comment you made about working through the grief or the rage, that can come up when people start to open that door from that longing you were describing in your client. How does one work through that? What does that work actually look like? Slowly. Right. Yeah.
So the key thing is, firstly, within CFT, we always do a lot of psychoeducation, so clients know where they are going. So we say to clients that sometimes, when you begin to walk down here, you begin to notice and feel pains and scars that perhaps you've kind of covered over for a while. And so when that begins to happen, we'll go with that and look at that. I know that Kristen and Chris have this idea of backdraft. We tend not to use that because that's a frightening concept, whereas actually what's behind it is the very thing that will heal you, right? And it's your ability to actually work with that stuff. That's so important. So we've had a discussion with the clients, so they know this. They know that actually that is the issue. And they know also that it's because we've done things like, the tricky brain and all that, why it's not their fault. And also about reclaiming their humanity, So there's quite a lot of preparation that goes into it. So they don't just sort of find themselves, they don't know what's happening. And we say this is a grief process and it will be painful. But we'll go step at a time. The idea isn't to overwhelm you. It's what we call challenging but not overwhelming. So you have to titrate it a bit. And once they're on the path, all kinds of strange things start happening. The dream life changes, the fantasy life changes. It's quite interesting.
So to state the obvious, you've developed compassion-focused therapy and compassionate mind training, which integrate evolutionary psychology, social constructivism, cognitive behavioral ideas, Buddhism. So how do we as individuals and societies and species get ourselves into the tangles that we get ourselves into?
Well, the first, I think, is the key thing, Alex, is thinking about the fact that probably we don't teach people that the brain is a problem. We're not taught the brain is a problem, but it's quite a serious problem. And the reason for that is because biological forms and mental forms, they evolve, but not necessarily, their progress is not necessarily a good thing if it goes in the wrong direction. Take, for example, the one that we often use is the female birth canal. When we decided to stand up, because basically our skeleton is designed as a coat hanger in the sea, right? So most animals are on all fours, but humans in their wisdom decided to stand up. That's why you have problems with backs and knees and goodness knows what. But what also happened is the pelvis narrowed the birth canal, which means that human females, as a result of that movement of standing up and narrowing the hips and so on, produces the most dangerous and painful births of all primates. More humans, females, will die in childbirth than any other primate, because it's a design mess up, really. Now, when you also recognize that over the last 2 million years or whatever it is, we've developed these amazing capacities for thinking and reasoning and mindfulness and empathy and all that. And if they're used by our caring motivational systems, then you end up with medicine and wonderful things, charity works and so forth. But here's the glitch. If they're used by other motivational systems like tribal or competitive, then you're in trouble, because they're the same intelligence that will make, weapons of mass destruction, nuclear bombs, blah, 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 and so on and so on. So there is a problem in the human brain, because the human brain has evolved these capacities, but they're not very well regulated. And they can become against yourself, because you can end up ruminating, get stuck in these loops. And this is where cognitive therapy has a huge insights into the link between this new brain ability to think and attribute and plan and have a sense of self and all that. I mean, Tim Ehrenbeck would say, there's those three, negative view of the self, the world, the future, the things. You can only do that because you have this brain. No other animal can do that. No chimpanzee can have a negative view of themselves. But you know what? I'm fat. Nobody likes me. I talk too much, Or a negative view of the future. I'm worried about next season in case there are no bananas. You know what I mean? So humans can, and these loops in the brain can drive quite a lot of depression and so on and so on. So that's an example where evolution has given and taken away. It's given us the potential to be wonderful, but it's also the potential to be absolutely dreadful to others and to ourselves.
You're right about how through evolution our brains were constructed in piecemeal fashion.
Yeah.
And the goal of evolution is reproduction and survival, and not fulfilled individuals.
That's absolutely right. I mean, that's true for every living thing. I mean, whether a hippopotamus, a rabbit, or a tree, evolution hasn't put you there to enjoy life.
Right. Yeah.
So then your program offers a path to organizing and cultivating our best angels, perhaps.
Yes, very much so. So I think the most important thing is to recognize that we're all programmed. It's we have to drop that narcissistic. I don't mean that in a negative way. I mean that self-identification with the mind. Now, Steve Hayes, of course, talks a lot about fusion, but for CFT, it's about fusion with your biological mind, because your biological mind is a creation of these are these physiological patterns that are going on. Now, in the Buddhist traditions, they say that your mind is like water. And water can contain a poison or a medicine, but it isn't either. But because water is clear, it doesn't know that. And this is the problem, that because we have these minds, this conscious awareness and sense of self, we start identifying with the patterns in our biological mind. So rage or anxiety or fear or whatever it is. But these are basically patterns that are bubbling away inside of you. And you can change them, get drunk or take drugs or have LSD or whatever it is. Change the neurophysiology and you'll change your experience. So it's very clear what's coming into your mind, into your brain, are physiological patterns, right? So why would you want to identify with that? Why would you want to identify that I am just a set of synapses going off that give me this experience of whatever it is. The second thing I think that's quite important is to recognize that all of us are versions of potential. Okay, so when we're born, we are kind of a potential, a set of potentials. Now, if I had been kidnapped as a 3-day-old baby into a violent drug gang and had violence on me and so forth, we know that that would have affected the genes that get turned on and off in me. My epigenetic profiles would be affected by growing up in a very stressful environment. So the degree of stress, amount of cortisol circulating in me as a child would have major impacts on a whole range of epigenetic stuff. Plus, of course, the architecture of my brain, the maturation of my frontal cortex, all of these things, right? So now then, if I'd been kidnapped as a 3-day-old baby, I wouldn't have chosen that. So we've got the situation where, hang on a minute, I didn't choose to be born. I didn't choose to be a human. I didn't choose to be a male or a female. I didn't choose to have a brain that's capable of all these different, having an amygdala and all that stuff. I didn't choose any of that. I didn't even choose the version that I am because I didn't choose where I was going to be born with. So what the hell is going on then? I didn't choose any of it. So why would I want to identify with anything? These are all patterns and versions. But, and here's the but, two things. Firstly, if I don't learn how to drive it, then it will get up to mischief. It can be harmful to myself and others. So there are many things in life that are not our fault, but we have to take control of them or do the best we can to take control. So, for example, if you're driving down the highway, going down at 70, 80 kilometers an hour, and then all of a sudden you hit a snowstorm, you have to stop, right? You have to slow down. You have to drive very carefully because the conditions now don't allow you to keep driving as you were. Now, that's not your fault that there's a snowstorm, but it is your responsibility to drive carefully. So it's not your fault. It's not our fault we've got this brain, but what we need to do is to learn how it works, and then we can start to steer it in the way that we want to. And that means steering it, in our view, towards compassion. Why? Because compassion has a physiological profiles which will harmonize and integrate a lot of stuff in your mind and also helps you to feel happy and supported and so on. Whereas competing and raging, that's not going to do it for you. So that's a very important process of learning and coming to terms with that we're all programmed. We're all programmed, okay? The greatest challenge of humanity at the moment, where we are right now, is where the Buddha was 2,500 years ago. Understand your programming, because if you don't, then you just keep acting it out. And then you can end up feeling bad or doing bad. So understand your programming. Don't over-identify it, but learn to be mindful and learn to identify with compassion, and that will start to put your mind into patterns which are much more conducive to well-being and pro-social behavior.
I'm wondering if it would be helpful in terms of helping people to understand their mind a little bit better, maybe to talk a little bit about the sort of 3 systems, the threat, affiliation, and reward systems that this piecemeal brain has kind of going on within it.
Yeah, so we have the 3 systems of emotion. So the first thing then is we begin with motives, because motives are always the driving force behind everything. The motives is what basically organizes your brain and your physiology. So you have 3 basic motives. All living things have 3 basic motives, or 3 basic life tasks. Firstly, all living things need to be able to detect and respond to threats to their existence. So if you're a tree, and you're running out of water, you curl your leaves and you kind of hunker down for a little bit. So that's the way they do with it. And some trees have defenses against insects and all kinds of stuff, don't they? So that's the most important thing. And the first thing is having systems built in that allows you to detect and respond to threats, losses, injuries. Now, in order for you to do that, then need to organize your body and your brain to take actions, okay? So then that means you need certain kinds of emotions. So, for example, if it's one kind of threat, the action might be to run away. So if it's a tiger or something like that, assuming that you can run faster than
Good luck.
Good luck. So certain types of threat trigger anxiety and fear, okay? And that means to take avoidant actions or to get away from, put as much distance as you can between the threat and you. But if it's another kind of threat that you want to kind of subdue or get rid of or take out the game, then that's anger. And that's an approach emotion. Then you move towards what's causing you the upset and you start to attack it or whatever. And then, of course, the third one is disgust, which is an expelling. So if you've taken in some foods which are horrible, you vomit them out. And when we have disgust, there's a kind of pushing away, getting rid of, cleansing, all that stuff. So those are your three basic emotions. Sadness is an important one, but it's a tricky one because sadness can also be associated with calming down. People can sometimes feel better after they've had a cry, that sort of thing. Whereas it's very rare that people feel better after they've had a panic attack. I've had a panic attack. I feel great,
Cleansed at last.
Cleansed at last. So sadness is a bit tricky. So the three basic emotions then that deal with the first life task are anxiety, anger, and disgust. And those life tasks and that emotional system for those life tasks are very much tuned by your early environment. Mm-hmm. So if in your early environment you are growing up in an environment where there is a lot of threats around you, you don't have much of a secure base or a safe haven, then that system becomes very, very sensitized, okay, making you much more vulnerable to mental health problems as you grow up. If, on the other hand, you grow up in a very loving, caring environment, you're much less likely to have your threat system sensitized. You're more likely to be able to feel good about yourself. You're more likely to be able to trust other people. You're more likely to feel you're living in a kind of nice world than a threatening one. Okay, so that's that. Then the second life task is you can't just walk around dealing with threats. You've also got to go out and achieve things. You've got to find food, shelter. If you're breeding, you need to breed. You need to find sexual partners, and then you also need to find resources to look after the kids. Get them food and keep them warm. Birds go and fish and bring fish back to the nest, don't they? And so on and so on. So then you've got a lot of things you need to go out and do. You can't just hang around running away from predators or whatever. You've got to go out and do things. And that requires a different type of emotion, a different type of physiological system to activate you to take an interest in rewards and resources and do things because you want to do them. They're pleasurable to do. And that system has its own physiology as well. And if you, for example, win the lottery, like in America, I think you can win big lotteries, can't you? Say $100 million or something like that. Supposing there's a really big resource comes your way, you will have a hypermania. Okay, so you'll probably find that you'll get very excited. Even when you're doing mindfulness, sitting there, the breath.
No match for millions of dollars.
No mindfulness is no match for millions. So you probably struggle to sleep tonight. You just won a lottery. You're just worth $100 million. So you have a racing mind and so on and so on. So there's a very direct connection between your dopamine systems and these achieving and gaining resources. Now, usually, of course, it's our actions that allow us to achieve resources and so forth. But that constant process of engaging and doing, giving us this buzz of dopamine, that's the drive system. The slight problem with the drive system is that it can become addictive. So in hunter-gatherer societies, for example, once they had enough food and so on, that was it. That was the end of the day. They'd sit around the campfire and chatted. But when we had agriculture and you could start to store resources, you never had enough. I mean, you could always have more, you could always have more, you could always have more, because you were storing it. You were building up these resources. And as you built up these resources, then you could start to trade with other people. And we now know that it was that period of our evolution when we went into agriculture that actually we then got the rise of the aggressive male who controlled resources. And the rest, unfortunately, is a pretty bad history. I mean, all of the major empires, from the Assyrians, the Romans, the Vikings, all of them, all dominated by aggressive males at the top who were pretty brutal, and underneath that, the subservient rest. And what we don't always recognize is that we have been living with terrorist states for quite a few thousand years. I mean, in this country, for example, you could be hung for doing hardly anything. Stealing the loaf of bread would get you hung, and so on and so on. So it was pretty brutal stuff. So the key thing then is recognizing that we have all these potential tendencies, but compassion is the thing that will bring us back into focus, that will help us with the dark side of the mind. So the third system then, so the drive system can get you can get addicted to it because we store. And, now we live in a world where something like, I don't know, I think it's 50 families hold 90% of the wealth or something like that. I mean, where millionaires compete with themselves because they feel they don't have enough compared to their neighbor next door. They've got 20 minutes, I've only got 10. Oh my God, what's the matter with me? So, we got this enormous problem with greed that people just want more and they want more. And they just, there's a really nice book called Willing Slaves by Madeline Bunting that we work. I mean, we're having to spend so much time of our lives working. Well, that wasn't what happened in hunter-gatherer societies. They'd go out and do a bit of hunting or a bit of gathering, and then they'd spend the rest of the time sort of, enjoying themselves. So we're living in a very strange world, really. So that's the drive system. We can overdo it. And the other problem with the drive system is that in order to entertain us, to stimulate that dopamine, we have to create greater excitements. And unfortunately, our excitements are getting more and more aggressive. We're getting more and more into vengeful entertainment, where the bad guys do horrible things, and then the good guys, Schwarzeneggers or whoever it is, come in and do horrible things to the bad guys, and everybody thinks, oh, that's great, that's so exciting. Well, yes and no. We're constantly stimulating vengeful violence, right? The good versus the bad, and this is not a good way to be seeing the world. So there's a lot of problems with the drive system. But then there's a third system, which is called rest and digest. Now, the drive systems tend to be activating emotions, exciting, achieving, doing, getting the buzz, all that stuff, dopamine stuff. But the soothing system is not. The soothing system is more of an acetylcholine system. It's associated more with the parasympathetic system, which is more of a calming, settling form of contentment, positive emotion, where you're just not trying to achieve anything or do anything. It's associated with a sense of safeness. And that's associated with all different kinds of changes in your brain and body. Now, rest and digest is basically what animals do when they've had enough to eat and they're not under any threat, because then the body is able to repair and recover. And rest and digest is a very important state of our minds and our bodies, and we've really not paid any attention to it at all. We think that to enjoy ourselves, we always have to be exciting. Now, the great thing about mindfulness, of course, is mindfulness pulls the plug on threat and drive. That's what it does. The idea is to be in the present moment, to allow your mind to be absolutely in the rest and digest system, not achieving, not doing, just observing, not running away, not being frightened, whatever, just being present in that moment. And of course, we do know that mindfulness does have major impacts on how the brain is and on the vagus and all of that stuff. So the rest and digest system is really important. And what we also know is that calming system, that parasympathetic system, was also adapted for attachment, whereby if a child was distressed, the mother would provide comfort to the child, and that would calm the child down. Now, evolution doesn't tend to come up with new designs all the time. It adapts. And so basically, caring behavior adapted the parasympathetic system so that signals of being cared for would stimulate this parasympathetic system, which would then calm down the threat system. And that's how parents help their children to regulate emotion. And that's what compassion does as well. Compassion can help regulate threat. Now, that doesn't mean that compassion is the soothing system, because if you're a firefighter laying down and risking your life to save somebody in the house, that's pretty compassionate. You're going to risk your life for somebody, but you're certainly not going to be in the rest and digest. You're not going to be walking into the burning house saying, oh, I'm now in a calm mind. Right. I feel myself, blah, 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 and I'm going into the house to rescue this family. No, it's not like that. So the motive of compassion is a motive. It's a thing, a caring motive. And the emotions of it depend on the context. So if you're a firefighter, you might be anxious. If you're fighting injustice, you might be angry. If you're counseling a bereaved or a dying person, you might be very sad. So the emotions really are all to do with the context. What links all of these things together is the desire to address suffering. That's all of them have the same motive, but the emotions are different. So those are the three systems that link on to the three life tasks: how to deal with threats, how to achieve things that are important to achieve, resources and stuff like that, and then how to allow your body to recognize enough is enough and you can rest and digest.
And you were saying that compassion you see as a motive that sort of exists before those three things, or sort of transmits itself through any of those different systems, or?
Yes. So motives then are the things that guide you and orientate you. So all living things have a basic set of motives to survive, obviously. Therefore, they have to find food, they have to find shelter. If they're sexually reproducing, they have to find a mate. If they are a mammal or an avian species, they'll have to look after their offspring. So those are all things they have to do to ensure survival and reproduction. So all of those things are there. Now, the emotions will depend upon how those motives are going. So, for example, if you are seeking food and you find plenty of food, and as an animal you find plenty of food, then that you're going to be quite satisfied with that. You'll eat it, and then you can rest and go into the soothing system. And also, if you're a bit stressed and people come and support you and care for you and cuddle you and make you feel good again, then puts you into the soothing system. So the emotions really are really dependent upon what you're doing and how it's going. That's true for any motive. So motives use emotions because emotions are the physiological changes of state which prepare you for certain actions. Okay, so an emotion will prepare you to attack or to run, or to engage, or to love, or to form affiliative relationships. So with compassion then, compassion is the motive to be carrying. The definition that we use is that we are sensitive to suffering and self and others, to be aware, to be orientated towards that, to have the courage to engage with suffering. And then the second part, the response, of stimulus response, the second part is the wisdom to know what to do. And the preparedness to work out that wisdom. So that's our definition: sensitivity to suffering, self, and others. Now, and then the wisdom of knowing what to do. But the emotion that you experience will be very much depending upon the context. If you're a firefighter or you're a counselor or whatever it is, and the soothing emotions, sometimes that's important, but not always. Sometimes you do want to be energized. So we have energizing compassion as well as soothing compassion tasks, where you imagine yourself engaging in compassionate acts which bring you joy.
In your book, you mentioned the problem of men not showing interest in compassion training. Perhaps if they understood its relationship to courage, acceptance, and responsibility, they would be more motivated.
I think that's a great point, Alex. Yeah, I mean, Chris Germer finds the same, that we don't have the males. The males will go to the kind of management courses where you're learning how to be competitive and effective and all this other stuff. There's nothing wrong with that. But the compassion side is really tricky for some males. Now, one of the things that we do with male, we do a lot of work in the prisons and so forth. We start off with the issue of compassion. We'll start off with an example of a firefighter and talking about the importance of courage, because if you haven't got courage, you're not going to be able to do anything, are you? If you don't have courage, how are you going to be able to approach any kind of potential suffering, particularly if it's a physical risk? So all of the risks, all of the rescue services, all of them are really associated with the preparedness to take risks in order to help others. That is fundamental. That's a fundamental compassion stuff. So basically these guys can agree that, okay? So then you say, however, there's a difference between physical courage and emotional courage. Now, where are you with emotional courage? Okay, you're prepared to experience physical pain, but are you able to experience emotional pain? Where are you with that? And of course, guys are all closed down. No, I'm not doing emotional pain. Forget it. I mean, the number of times when I work with aggressive guys, and you can see that they're beginning to work with some of the trauma in their background. They have this deep yearning to be loved, like people do, and they might start to tear up, and they'll look at you really aggressively, and they'll say, "Don't do that. I'm not crying here. You understand this? I didn't come here for you to make me cry." Now, and they might even swear at you, right? They can't do it. They can't do it. One of our veterans, very sad, he said, because he'd working with his traumas and he'd seen his friend blown up on a landmine and everything. And he said, "I've always had the courage to die, but never to cry." And that's a problem. That's a problem. And the point is, a lot of these in therapy, these guys that have all this aggressive stuff, they know underneath this, there's a lot of pain, you know. I mean, if you read Mary Trump's analysis of Donald, I mean, the guy's he's in a serious pain, but the only way he can deal with that is this the way that he's dealing, and I think that's very, very sad. So the ability to tolerate deep emotional pain, deep yearning, deep sense of loneliness, all of that stuff, guys find that really, really hard. They're not courageous when it comes to emotional pain. The other thing with guys is that when they start crying, for guys, is the most frightening of all their emotions, because as one guy said to me, I just hate it because I can't see, I can't breathe, I lose muscle control. I'm really so vulnerable. And also, because of our societies, we have been basically war societies for thousands of years. Guys are constantly being prepared for warrior psychology. You know, all of our entertainments is all warrior psychology. You've got to go out there. You've got to be prepared to sacrifice yourself for your families or your country, whatever it is. Otherwise, you're not a real man, all this stuff. And the one thing you cannot have these men doing is crying. They got to be fearless, you know, they got to be tough. Otherwise, they're useless. Once they start crying, they're useless because they can't see, they can't run, they can't move, they can't blah, 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 blah. So there's often a real stigma against men being emotionally touched and moved and frightened and vulnerable because we're a warrior, you know, and we still haven't changed that psychology.
So how does compassion build courage and motivation?
Okay, so one of the things that we do when we introduce compassion in the clinic is to ensure that our clients understand what we're talking about, because, you know, we're slightly different from Kristen and Chris, because we don't go anywhere near kindness or anything like that, certainly with depressed people and aggressive people, because it's tricky. So what we say to our clients is, coming for a compassion-focused therapy, do you know what that is? And they may say, yes, I've got to be nice to myself, I've got to love myself, or something like that. And we say, well, just put that all onto one side. We say to the client, you have a lot of intuitive knowledge. Now, let me use a guided discovery with you, if that's okay. And they say, okay. And you say, well, bring to mind somebody that you really care about, a really good friend. Can you bring them to mind? What is it you like about them? So you prime them with the feeling for their friend, okay? And then you say, okay, so I want you to imagine then that your friend phones you up and says, look, I've just had a letter from the hospital. I've got to go for this operation. It's quite important and I can't go. And I'm a hospital phobic. I've never been able to go to hospital. I'm absolutely terrified. I can't go. And they're crying. So you say to the client, okay, so if your friend is like that, how would you be with them? What would you say? What would you do? Okay? And of course, what they say, oh, I'd be really upset. I'd be worried for them. And so you'd be sensitive to their distress. Oh, yeah. Well, you would, wouldn't you? Of course, you'd be sensitive to your distress. You'd be concerned for them. Yeah, I'd be concerned for them. Okay, that's great. And then what might you do to help them? Oh, I don't know. Maybe I'd go to the hospital with them. I'd hold their hand. Why would you do that? Oh, because when you're very frightened, if you have somebody that supports you and cares about you, that's important, isn't it? I mean, to do it alone is very difficult. And then you stand back and you say, you have wonderful wisdom about compassion, because you know when we're frightened or distressed, if we're sensitive to that suffering rather than attack it or criticize it, if we're sensitive and we engage with it, just like you would engage with your friend, and we work out the wisdom of what to do, which is to be supportive, understanding, to stand with ourselves in that pain, that will get us through. That is compassion. That's what we're going to do in our therapy, working how to be sensitive to our distress, understanding it, work with it, not avoiding it, not pushing it away, getting rid of it, and developing the wisdom and the skills and the talents and the body, actually, to be able to wisely deal with your pain. So you, like standing with your friend, holding your friend's hand, you'll be able to do that for yourself as you're working through your pain. So that's how we then introduce compassion. So we show them that they're already working on this, developing the courage to be sensitive and the wisdom to know what to do.
And you also talk about how compassion can also be conceptualized as a process of nurturing.
Yes.
Would you say it's almost like reparenting?
Yes. Well, it is, because you see, in the attachment system, John Bowlby pointed out there are 3 dimensions to it. One is called proximity seeking. Now, this system is important because it maintains the linkage between the parent and the infant. So if the infant wanders off, they become threatened by that, and so they'll out of being threatened, they'll start to try and find their parent. And if the parent wanders off and they lose contact with the infant, then they will become anxious and try and find the infant. So this is a mechanism to keep them together. If either of them weren't that bothered, that would be a problem. So if the infant wandered off but didn't care at all about whether the parent was there, whether whether at night or whatever, they just kept wandering, that would be a problem. So this issue, this of pulling towards that which can care for you and be helpful to you, that's built into the proximity-seeking mechanisms within the attachment system, that both parent and child should strive to stay in close connection. And if they get too far away from each other, then they're brought back together. So that's the first thing. The second thing, John Bob, we talked about, is that the parent provides a secure base. And this secure base provides a lot of psychological nurturance to the child. It gives the child confidence. It values the child. It gives the child a sense of being held positively in the mind of the other. The parent shows the child through play and positive engagement and so forth. So the child experiences security. They don't have to be vigilant to threat because the parent is protecting them. There is no threat because the parent keeps the threat away. The parent gets hurt. And the parent themselves is not a threat. The parent themselves is a playful, engaging, providing agent, providing food and comfort and warmth. So that's the secure base. And then the safe haven, which is the ability for the parent to calm the child when the child is distressed. So that means that the child is able to trust the parent, and having contact with the parent, they can be calmed and soothed down. So those are the key qualities then of a compassionate mind. Okay, so your compassionate mind, when you develop your compassionate mind, it has to have the ability that you will, if you're distressed, remember to go and find it. In other words, when you're angry or upset, remember to take a breath or two and try and reconnect with that part of your brain systems, those physical systems which are about compassion. And then your compassionate mind will have ways of validating your experience, being empathic to your experience, supporting your experience, encouraging you to take risks where you need to, and if you need it, to be able to calm you down, to have a soothing quality to it. So compassion then, as you say, is rated in this idea of nurturing. The psychology of nurturing is this provision of environments for growth, maturation, confidence, feeling good about yourself, and also your ability to self-regulate, to soothe when you need to.
This feels like a good place to maybe bring up the idea of shame, which I know that you have done a lot of thinking about, just shame in general and helping people with shame-based difficulties. And I'd love to hear more about your work and your ideas in that area, because my sense is that it just doesn't get nearly enough attention. I think I went through my whole graduate school without hearing anyone talk about shame. So I'd love to hear a little bit about what you're thinking on this, what you've sort of come to know about shame and how to help people with it.
Yes, I think that's a great question because, as you say, I think there has been a lot of shame about talking about shame. Now, shame is, in a way, the enemy of compassion, and we'll explore why that is in a moment. But the first thing is to think about how we can separate shame and guilt, for example. Now, shame is very much related to social rank. So if you watch animals that are attacked or whatever, they will show submissive behaviors where they, turn away, they look away. They try and make their bodies smaller to defend themselves against attacks from others. And that is basically shame. Shame is an experience that in some way or other, we are negative. There's something bad about us. If people knew this about us, then they would push us away or attack us or criticize us. So shame is an experience of something not right about the self, that we are attackable. We are rejectable because of whatever it is, you see. Again, with the thing about shame, like compassion, there's no particular emotion associated with shame. Some people, if you criticize them and shame them, they'll attack you. Other people will become anxious. Other people will just close down. Sometimes you can have what is called a heart sink feeling. I remember when I was at school, I wasn't the brightest kid, actually. And so when the exam results were posted up, all the names would be on the sheet. They'd have all the names on the sheets, because this is in the 60s and it was very shamey in school. And then there'd be a red line, and everybody above the red line had passed, everybody below the red line had failed. And of course, it was done on purpose to shame people. Of course, I would look at this list and see, oh my God, Gilbert, under the line, fail. So you get this heart sink, heart sink. Oh, that tends to be a unique shaming feeling, which is a sense of yourself literally wanting to crawl away. So shame is really much about these processes of feeling devalued, or it's a disconnect. People find out about this. And some of our clients can have the view that, if you get close to me, you'll see the bad in me, and then you won't want to treat me anymore, or you won't like me anymore. And if I get close to you, I'm going to see the bad in you, and then I won't be able to trust you anymore. So this shaming dynamic about, are you trustworthy? Are you good? Are you not good? Will you like me? Will you not like me? If you discover this thing about me, that is a really major issue in therapy. And of course, it's also linked to what we call the secret that people have. And this is where sometimes when you're working with high shame patients, you're never quite sure if you know all the story, because they're ashamed to tell you things, because they're worried about how you're going to take it or whatever. So like with people who are drinking, they'll tell you, I'm drinking probably a bottle of whiskey a day. And it's more like 4 or 5. People won't tell you that they're beating up their partners or whatever, or they're beating up all the kids or other things, or the fantasies that they might have, that whatever it is. So, shame is a very, very major issue. And we spend a lot of time talking about shame, because shame also gives you this feeling of unlovability, ultimately deep down, there is this issue with you. Something you've done, or something you failed, or a hatred or a sexual thing or whatever, that makes you into this shameful person that's not worth bothering with.
Seems to be some stigma and a taboo almost.
Yes, that's absolutely right, Alex. And shame often begins in the social environment as a stigma, right? So like we were talking before, men get stigmatized if they cry, and people get stigmatized if they're in certain cultures, if they're overweight. Whereas in other cultures, being overweight is regarded as a good thing, because it means you've got resources. But in our society, ever since the days of Twiggy, I guess, I don't know, maybe weight becomes an issue for shaming. And we know that in social media, a lot of what goes on in social media is shaming. And it's the new way. Well, it's not the new way. It's the human way in which we attack each other. So if we were primates, we would fight each other and challenge the subordinates and go and bite them from time to time just to make sure they stay subordinate. But we don't do that, not so much. We more like to shame each other and make sure that we can subordinate people. We need to be able to subordinate people, make them feel bad, make them feel disconnected from the group, because that gives us a feeling of power. And that's a problem. So the shamer is equally a problem as the shamed.
How does mindful compassion help people take responsibility? I imagine it may be related to shame to some extent.
Yeah, I think it's a great point, that's right. So one of the key issues is helping people to recognize that shame can be helpful. Like if you shame companies because they're polluters or whatever it is, there are ways in which shame can be. And mild shame, a mild sense of having done something wrong, can inspire people to correct. I don't want to do that again. But the shame that we see in the clinic is usually quite destructive. It's not helpful. So you have to make a distinction between shame and guilt. So shame is primarily evolved from the rank system. It's all to do with, subordinates and how you're looked at and whether you're inferior and whether you're worth anything. Guilt, on the other hand, evolved from the caring system. And caring, when we began caring, we had to also make sure that we didn't inadvertently harm our offspring. Now, they do get harmed. They do get sat on and squashed and suffocated. But generally speaking, when a parent has caused harm, in the wild that is, they will try and repair that. So guilt is very much associated with having caused harm but being motivated to repair it. Shame doesn't necessarily motivate you to repair the harm. It'll motivate you to repair your reputation, but not necessarily the harm. So shame, the emotions of guilt, typically are remorse and sadness. Whereas in shame, they're much more likely to be anger and anxiety and confusion and avoidance and all that. So if you imagine two people having an affair, Tom and Harry, called Tom and Harry, their partners discover this, and Tom thinks, oh no, my partners discovered this, they are now they now think I'm no good and I betrayed them and I've let them down and they're going to tell my friends and they think I'm no good. And do you know what? I think I'm no good either. That is all shame. That's all me. And don't forget me, right? So I'm a bad person. They think I'm a bad person. Maybe I am a bad person. Whereas in guilt, the self is not really such an issue. The guilt is, for whatever reason, this has happened. I had no intention of hurting my partner. I've now got to try and repair this because I feel for the pain I've caused. I feel for the pain I've caused. And that's a different shame. People tend not to feel for the pain they've caused. Guilt really certainly do. And this is important when we're working in the prisons because, the prisons try and shame people. But when you do that, you simply drive them away from the very thing they need to experience, which is a sense of remorse and sadness. Now, they're only going to do that if they don't feel personally under attack. Otherwise, they have to go into defense mode, right? So you have to be able to help them with that. And we also know that if they have not processed the harm that was done to them, if they haven't processed the hurt that they experienced as kids or whatever, their system for being in tune with pain is flattened. It doesn't, there's quite a lot of research now showing that in some of these individuals, they don't really respond very much to their own pain. So they're not going to be able to respond to the pain they cause other people. So once again, the key thing is getting the psychology right, that you do want people to be able to have a genuine sense of sadness and remorse, but that doesn't mean that they have to then do a beat-up job on themselves, because that's the wrong system. You're in the wrong motivational system altogether. The physiology is all wrong. You need to get into the caring system, and in the caring system is the potential for grieving and for sadness and for recognizing I didn't mean to do that.
In your book, Living Like Crazy, you talk about destructive and crazy patterns we fall into, the darker impulses of humankind. Anything you'd like to say on that theme? I think it's really important, especially right now. I mean, we're here in America dealing with some really difficult, dark impulses we're finding among us.
I think that's brilliant. And I think what's happening, of course, right around the world is that actually what's underneath it all is threat. Because the problem with capitalist societies and competitive societies is that those who are getting rich, we now know the richer you get, the less compassionate you become, and the more you become worried about losing what you've got. So as you become richer, you become much less interested in paying your taxes and so on. You want to, what we call, control and hold your resources. So the right wing are very much about freedom to control and hold. Winner takes all. If you make a lot of money, it should be your money. You shouldn't have to pay taxes and all that stuff. And that's all right, except for the fact that it creates havoc around you. Because for those who don't have, then their threat is, I'm not going to have a job. I won't be able to earn any money at all. I'm going to say. So if you look at a lot of what the people say about Trump, the reason they liked him was he talked to their threat. For the rich people, he said, well, reduce taxes so you can keep your resources. So they were like that. And to the other people, he said, we will try and make sure you've got jobs. We'll reactivate, the industries. It doesn't matter about climate change and giving jobs in the coal mines or whatever. And so they like that. It's very simple, really, that we live in a society that because we have so backed off from caring and sharing, we've created a society so much that people think it's really up to me as to whether I succeed or whether I don't, that people are really very, very frightened about the future, but for very different reasons. And the left wing haven't really got it. The left wing are very keen on caring and sharing, which is great, but people think, hang on a minute, I'm not sure I can afford to do that. It frightens them. Caring and sharing frightens them. And so we have to find a way in which we can create the kinds of psychology that we had after the Second World War, where there was a genuine desire to create a better world. And we did. For 15 years, 20 years, we did. I mean, in the UK, we had the health service and so on and so on. Taxes were high and everybody was contributing. We wanted to make this world a better world. Health for all, education for all, fantastic. And then, of course, during the 70s and 80s, back came this idea. Yes, but wouldn't you like to hold on to more of your resources? Wouldn't you like to pay less tax? Do you really need to pay for all these people to have health care when you can actually hold on to your own money and get even better health care if you have the money yourself, right? So that was the story, and we know what happened. So I think that problem that we've got at the moment is that it's become very tribal and very aggressive without really understanding that what's going on underneath is that this is what living like crazy is done, that in creating all of this wealth, we've actually created the devil in a way, because we've created these extraordinary variations of resources. You have the have-somes and the have-nones. We've created a history of the world which has been violent to the extreme, fighting, rich people, the leaders of the world just going to war after. To do some research on Genghis Khan, a horrendous guy, right? And so on and so on. We haven't created a loving, caring world. You'd think we've got agriculture. We're not going to starve. We've got all these wonderful resources. Why aren't we creating a caring world? Because we should be. We've got far more than 200 years ago. We're just amazing. And yet we're not, because we don't understand that wealth creates fear. For those who feel they can't get an action to it, and those who feel they're going to lose it. If we don't find a politics that can learn how to deal with that fear in those that feel they haven't got and those that feel they have got, we're going to keep splitting and producing these tribal conflicts, which are not very helpful. So that is partly what living like crazy is about. We have created societies inadvertently that have driven us mad. And I personally think that the humans now are slightly crazy in our entertainments, in our vulnerabilities to mental health problems, in our greed, in our tribal violence. I mean, so many areas that we're just a little bit nuts, really. We do such destructive things, The planet is going down the tubes, and yet we're carrying on, And it just, if you took any one individual and said, look, you're going to live your life to mess up your environment, destroy the home that you live in, ensure that you won't have enough food in the future, you'd say, hang on a minute, this person's crazy. But that's what we're doing as a society. That's what we're doing as a world.
So in your work, you're also offering a potent social critique. And I guess our world is in need of a rethink, socially, economically, politically.
Very much so. And it's not about good and bad people. What we have to understand is there are these ancient, evolved algorithms. That's what they are, to care and share versus control and hold. And we've created an environment where the algorithm of control and hold is more powerful than care and share. You see that, but when you put humans under a crisis like COVID, for example, all of a sudden you see the other side of humanity, where many people, in the hospitals were risking their lives in the hospitals. There, you had many people volunteering to help others here. I'm sure where you are as well. I mean, you had people that weren't so helpful, of course, but there was an outpouring of wanting to be helpful. Visiting the elderly people who couldn't get out, and so on and so on. There are amazing networks of helpfulness growing up all over the place. So we do have this real amazing potential to be wonderful if we can find a way that we can cooperate. If you look at, say, like Band-Aid and concerts where people come together for a cause, we love doing that. We love doing that. So we need to find a way in which we can begin to orientate people towards the cause of creating a compassionate world and come together and have a sense of belonging in this cause. That's what we want to do. And that's one of the things that I'm very excited about now, that around the world in businesses and schools, this idea about live to be helpful, not harmful, is really catching on. I mean, that's not to me, that's just a movement in compassion in general, but there's businesses now are beginning to say, well, maybe we shouldn't just pollute. Maybe we do need to be careful about. Maybe we want to make a contribution to humanity, but we don't want to harm humanity. Maybe we don't want to exploit our workers. So these ways of thinking about how to be in the world are changing. Even in the last 10 years, you see these big changes just beginning to sweep through. Mindfulness is coming into schools now. Compassion training is coming into schools. Businesses are getting interested in what they call moral business. So I think, it is actually, although it looks pretty bad sometimes, like, with the politics, actually there are also some wonderful things going on as well.
It may be that since these are social and cultural problems, the solutions need to be at that level. But is there any advice you might have for an individual listener right now who's feeling like they're grappling with this sort of tribalism that they're seeing all around them, or they're trying to sort of hold their ground in this sort of competitive culture?
Yes, I think so. And, there are various meditations you can do where you can imagine yourself as a compassionate crusader or whatever it is, all those sorts of things. But I think the most important thing is, look, it's very easy to be attracted to the dark side because that's what our media is about, right? A lot of our media likes to sow conflict between parties and play one off against another. Certainly in this country, they're always interested in playing the Labour Party off against Conservatives and stuff like that because they can sell the blood on the carpet. That's what they sell. But don't get caught up in that, okay? Learn to pay attention to the good, okay? Pay attention to what's happening. Put in moral business. Look at, we are destroying the rainforest, but look at the projects which are rebuilding the rainforests. Okay, we're struggling with some of our reefs, but look at the projects that are rebuilding the reefs around the world. In other words, learn to pay attention to the millions and millions and millions of people who are doing charity work, working in Africa, building wells. Look at the work that's going on now. Scientists working flat out to get a vaccine for us, right? Now, it's not just for money. It's also because people genuinely want to bring a vaccine into the world to stop suffering. So the problem with the media that we've got at the moment is that they turn down the covers and all of the wonderful things that are happening. And we forget that actually 200 years ago, we had slavery. Well, we don't have that anymore. I mean, there are still slaves in the world, but you can't just go to Africa and pick up a few people and, you can't do that anymore. You can't have a Roman Games anymore. You can't do that anymore, okay? So to be aware that, yes, we are in a dark, it is difficult, but, there is a gradual light emerging in the world in all kinds of places, and to focus on that and become a part of that. Yes, there are dark forces, and sometimes it's like walking through treacle, but we're going in the direction of increasing compassion. We've got a lot of problems. But I think there's an increasing will. I mean, Joe Biden, I don't know him, but he looks to be somebody who's interested in cooperation as opposed to conflict. So I think, there's hope.
Thank you. I see it that way as well, personally. Yeah. And that seems like a nice note maybe to end on. So thank you so much for your time and for your insights and for all of the work you've put forth into the world. Last question is just if people are really enjoying this conversation and your ideas, where can people find you, follow you? What kind of stuff do you have out there? Where can you direct people?
Yeah, so there are two websites to have a look at. One is called The Compassionate Mind. So just put Compassionate Mind, one word, .co.uk. And there's a members area. You can link up to that. That's got a lot of training materials, videos of therapy and stuff like that. And there's another one called CompassionateWellbeing.com, Compassionate Wellbeing. And there's a whole series of talks on there about how to use compassion to manage your life, really.
Thanks so much for your time today.
Well, thank you for inviting me, Kate and Alex. It's been lovely talking with you. And I get very enthusiastic about these things. And they're great. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thanks for listening today.
If you enjoyed this episode, we hope you'll hit subscribe, leave us a great rating or review, and spread the word. You can also go to noblemindpodcast.com to join our email list. You'll get a weekly behind-the-scenes message, news, announcements, and other special goodies we come up with just for you. Thanks for listening, and bye for now.